himself. So the ascent of Mount Carmel, John uses that image from the reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah, that God is going to call us to climb the mountain. Okay? So that reading that I did at the beginning, that was the reading from Mass on Monday of the first week of Advent. So we started Advent with that invitation from God to climb the mountain. God is inviting us to climb the mountain in order to encounter the presence of God. He's inviting us up. In the Carmelite Missal, the Missal that the Carmelite community uses for the celebration of Mass, on the solemnity of St. John of the Cross, on his feast day, in the opening prayer for that Mass, the mountain is identified as Christ. To ascend Mount Carmel is to climb, if you will, Christ. To go up the mountain of the Lord is to climb Christ. It's to go deeper and deeper, or higher and higher, into relationship with Christ. So the image of the mountain is really related to our relationship with Christ. And so here in his commentary in Book 3 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, chapter 35, article 5, John writes this: their heart, meaning us who are seeking the presence of God, their heart is not attached to these goods. And if these are taken away, their grief is slight. Okay, so you think about the things that you're most attached to in life. Okay, family, friends. Okay, maybe some material possessions like your home. If your home caught on fire, chances are the first thing that you would want to get out of it is your family. Irreplaceable. The home can be replaced. You might have a slight grief over losing your home if your family at least was saved. Right? So John is saying here, in the spiritual life, what God does is helps us to prioritize the things that we value. What's going to be most important? Okay? Some things that we consider to be good may very well need to be let go of. So their heart is not attached to these goods, and if they are taken away, their grief is slight. They seek the living image of Christ crucified within themselves. Okay? This is a theme that is common to the Carmelite spiritual tradition. Where do we go looking for God? Not just way out there someplace at the furthest reaches of the universe. And not just in church or in spiritual places. In the Carmelite tradition, we go seeking God within, because God has joined God's life to our lives. When you were baptized, Father, Son, and Spirit, the Trinity, came to dwell in you, united their life to your life. When you were confirmed, you were told you are a temple of the Holy Spirit. What does that mean? You're the dwelling place of God. When you receive the Eucharist, that very act of eating and drinking becomes for us a reminder and a deepening of the presence of God dwelling within us. We are living tabernacles. Okay, so this is all a part of the Carmelite tradition. Where do we go seeking the presence of God? Where do we go seeking Christ? We begin by going within. And John says we go within seeking the crucified Christ. We're not seeking suffering. We're seeking to know the depths of God's love. Because that's what the crucifixion is about. It's not about suffering. It is about God pouring God's love out for our sake. It is the deepest expression of the love that God has for us. And we are called to love one another in the same way. Okay? To love one another even unto death. To have that profound love for one another. They seek the living image of the Christ crucified within themselves. And thereby they are pleased rather to have everything taken from them and to be left with nothing. Now, when you pick up John the Cross and you read something like that, it'd be real easy to say, oh my gosh, this impossible. Just can't be done. This sounds too hard. Let's go back to Therese and the roses and the little way, or let's go back to Teresa of Avila and all the nice things that she says about what can happen to us in prayer. This sounds like it's way too hard. Well, this is where I think we need to come to some understanding of what it means to enter into the intimate embrace of God that John is inviting us to. So John actually has sort of a contemplative formation process. How do we make ourselves available to God so that God can give us the gift of contemplative prayer, so that God can reveal himself to us in a profound and intimate way? What does John advise us to do? And this is found in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, Book 1, Chapter 13. So if you pick this up, the first major treatise in the collected works is the Ascent of Mount Carmel. I don't necessarily advise that you begin with the Ascent of Mount Carmel, because most people get to chapter 13, read what he has to say, and abandon reading him because it all sounds crazy. It's probably better off to start reading the Spiritual Canticle and John's commentary on that poem. But I'm going to focus on the Ascent of Mount Carmel, chapter 13, because this is where John kind of outlines his contemplative formation process. How do we make ourselves available to receiving the gift of contemplation? So John presents this program for entering the contemplative way in Book 1, Chapter 13, Articles 3 to 11 in the Ascent of Mount Carmel. Okay? The first principle that he presents. First, have a habitual desire to imitate Christ in all your deeds by bringing your life into conformity with his. You must then study his life in order to know how to imitate him and behave in all events as he would. So, the foundation of Carmelite spirituality, and hopefully for those of you who've been coming to all of these sessions, you've picked this up from the other presentations. The foundation of Carmelite spirituality is, in fact, devotion to the humanity of Jesus. Yes, he was fully divine, but he was also fully human. And the Carmelites want us, and John especially wants us, to get in touch with Jesus in the Gospels. So, how do we do this? You immerse yourself in the real Jesus of the Gospel, so as to become identified with him, which means we need to be reading the Gospels, okay, and praying with them and reflecting upon them. When people ask me, where should I start in reading the Gospels, I always suggest start with Luke or with Matthew. Those are probably the two easiest ones to begin with, and get to know Jesus by following the course of his life in these Gospels. But make sure you're getting in touch with the real Jesus. To be identified with Jesus is more than just following a model, more than just imitating him. It's to become one with him. And of course, one with the Father and the Spirit, because Jesus never does anything apart from them, so that our living is affected by this union with him. Okay, but that means getting to know the real Jesus of the Gospels. So, when prayerfully reflecting upon the Gospels, notice Jesus' relationships, how he deals with people, how he expresses his emotions, what he values. Okay? Take in the real Jesus. He was born an infant, completely helpless, entrusted to the care of Mary and Joseph. Even in his young life, there were people who were seeking to kill him. His family lived in fear. He was born into poverty. His was not an easy life. Even growing up in Nazareth, in his father's carpenter shop. Not an easy life. Okay? And then when he moves off into his public ministry, You know, there were those who accepted him and welcomed him with great joy, and there were those who derided him and mocked him and plotted against him. Okay? Even his own disciples, whom he called, were not always the best of companions. Look at the emotions of Jesus. There are times when he finds great joy in them, like when he sent them out and they come back and they tell him all the great things that they did, and he rejoices in prayer over that. And then there are times where they question what he's doing or what he's teaching, and he's like, how long do I have to put up with you guys? He gets frustrated with them. He shows emotion at the death of Lazarus, his friend. Okay? He's afraid in the garden on the night before he died. He cries out to his Father from the cross in anguish, my God, why have you abandoned me? There is no emotion that you and I have experienced that Jesus has not experienced. And John wants us to get in touch with the real Jesus, not a plasticized Jesus, but get in touch with the real Jesus. And the only way to do that is really to delve into the Gospels and to notice these things, his relationships, how he deals with people, the kind of conversations that he has, how he reacts to people reacting to him. What's the flow of his own emotions? What is it that he values? That's going to help us to get in touch with the real Jesus. The second principle, and this is where it gets a little sticky. The second principle that John presents. Second, in order to be successful in this imitation, so if we're really going to imitate Jesus, if we're going to become identified with him, renounce and remain empty of any sensory satisfaction that is not purely for the honor and glory of God. Do this out of love for Jesus Christ. In his life, he had no other gratification, nor desired any other than the fulfillment of his Father's will, which he called his meat and food. By this method, you should endeavor then to leave the senses as though in darkness, mortified and emptied of that satisfaction. With such vigilance, you will gain a great deal in a short time. Okay? So what's John saying here? Is he saying you can't enjoy music or a movie because it doesn't have a religious theme to it? Okay. Renounce and remain empty of any sensory satisfaction that is not purely for the honor and glory of God. Do this out of love for Jesus Christ. Is that what he's saying? That you can't enjoy simply family gatherings? People coming together? Having lunch with some friends? Enjoying a good meal? Is that what he's saying here? That's oftentimes what people read into this. But when you get to know John, it's not about just giving up things that we like. He's not calling us to a perpetual Lent. All right? What John is inviting us to is finding God in all things. Can I find God in this relationship? Can I find God in this experience? Can I find God in this piece of music? I mean, you could be listening to a wonderful piece of classical music that has absolutely no religious themes at all, but you stand and wonder that somebody could come up with this. That even hundreds of years later we would still be listening to it. All right? Or music that moves us. Music that moves us. Okay? So many of the Christmas carols, and not all of them religious, this time of year, what do they make us think of? But Christmas has gone by. Family members who have gone before us. Growing up as a child. Fond memories. Are those not reflections of God's love and the gifts that God has given to us? All right? So John is saying, find God in all things. To become identified with Jesus, seek him in everything. In all things, times, places, and people. Look for him everywhere. Okay, look for him everywhere. That seeking may require some persistent digging. But remember, the real Jesus sat down at dinner parties, eating and drinking with tax collectors, prostitutes, and other assorted sinners. Such activity was in conformity with his Father's will because he found God present and working there. You know, the religious leaders of his own faith community looked at Jesus and said, "What are you doing hanging out with these people? You shouldn't be doing that. You can't possibly be from God because a holy person would never hang out with these people." But Jesus did because he could find the presence of God working in their lives and calling them to a life of conversion and holiness. Sometimes it takes a little bit of digging to find where God is working in our lives. Okay? But if you can't find there, if you can't find the real Jesus in something, then you need to let it go. Okay? Then you need to let it go. Simple example. Get to the end of the day. You think to yourself, "Oh my gosh, I haven't prayed at all today. But I'm like really tired. I think I'd rather sit down and watch some inane show on TV, rather than pray." Well, are you going to find God in that inane show that you've seen 6 million times before in reruns? Or is God asking you to let go of it and spend a few moments in prayer? Okay? This is really about discernment. It's about trying to discover where is God in everything. Okay? The third principle. This just keeps getting better. Listen to this. Endeavor to be inclined always, not to the easiest, but to the most difficult. Not to the most delightful, but to the most distasteful. Not to the most gratifying, but to the less pleasant. Not to what means rest for you, but to hard work. Not to the consoling, but to the unconsoling. Not to the most, but to the least. Not to the highest and most precious, but to the lowest and most despised. Not to wanting something, but to wanting nothing. Do not go about looking for the best of temporal things, but for the worst. And for Christ, desire to enter into complete nakedness, emptiness, and poverty in everything in the world. You should embrace these practices earnestly and try to overcome the repugnance of your will toward them. If you sincerely put them into practice with order and discretion, you will discover in them great delight and consolation. Okay, these principles, this sounds like a pretty tough way of living. Okay? To strive not for what's easy, but for what's difficult. Not for what's most delightful, but what's most distasteful. All right, so one of the examples that some of you have heard me say before is, when it comes to making choices, if I have a choice between chocolate cake or green beans, chocolate cake is always going to win out. Because that's where my will is attracted. Because that's what I love. I can tolerate green beans, but I love chocolate cake. All right? So that's where my will is going to be directed. But if I ate chocolate cake morning, noon, and night, my health would be a mess. All right? So there's got to be a balance here. Right? And ultimately, this is really what John is calling for, is for us to bring balance to our life by knowing ourselves and what motivates us. Okay? By knowing ourselves and what motivates us. Okay? So, go back to that example before about prayer. Getting to the end of the day, not having spent any time in prayer, thinking I'm just going to sit down and watch this nonsense TV program. Why? Because I find that easier to do, to simply veg out in front of the television set. And yesterday when I prayed, it wasn't all that hot anyway. I kind of struggled all the way through it. It was a bit boring. Why should I repeat that? Well, but what is God calling us to? Where am I going to find God? Right? So it's about bringing balance to our lives. Okay? It's about bringing balance to our lives. Because if we're left to our own devices, we have a tendency to follow the path of least resistance. We're always going to do what's going to be easiest for ourselves, based upon my needs, my wants, my desires, my agenda, my plan. That's what we want, because that's what's easiest. If everybody in the world would just agree with me, the world would be a much better place. And isn't that the way? So oftentimes, we have a tendency to approach life. God knows we see it enough in political and corporate life. People thinking, just do what I say, believe what I believe, and everything will be perfect. But this is about taking an honest look at ourselves and asking ourselves, well, what is it that's really motivating me? What's really moving me? Am I simply living my life centered on myself rather than on what God is inviting me to? Notice that in these principles, John says these practices must be carried out with order and discretion. Okay? So that means, I can still have chocolate cake. Okay? Order and discretion, balance. I can still have chocolate cake. I appreciate the chocolate cakes my mom used to make. There were certain chocolate desserts that she used to make that we always looked forward to. And they were a sign of her love for us. I could find God in a chocolate cake. All right? So it's like, it looks good, it tastes good, it was made with love, and usually anytime I'm eating chocolate cake, it oftentimes reminds me of Mom and some of our celebrations we used to have as a family when my parents were still around. All right? Order and discretion. Okay, order and discretion. You can still relish good things in life, providing, yes, it's a part of God's will. It's God's desire for us. And we do that with order and discretion. I'm not going to eat chocolate cake morning, noon, and night. There's got to be a place for green beans in there, too. All right? So, some needs, wants, desires may be legitimately in accord with God's will. Okay? May very well be in accord with God's will. Now, if my doctor came to me tomorrow and said, you are on the verge of becoming a diabetic, no more chocolate cake for you, that would change things. That would change things. And now you have to think about, well, what's the higher value? What's God calling me to? What's God calling me to? Take care of my health. How can I serve others if I'm not healthy? Okay? So now I have to make a different choice, right? Because the situation has changed. Where is God in all of this? How do I bring balance about? Okay, how do I bring balance about? So John's calling us to be discerning. Okay, John's calling us to be discerning. And then the fourth and final principle that he presents in chapter 13. First, try to act with contempt for yourself, and desire that all others do likewise. Second, endeavor to speak in contempt of yourself, and desire all others to do so. Third, try to think lowly and contemptuously of yourself, and desire that all others do the same. Okay? In this age in which we live, where psychology has really pushed forward the whole idea of a poor self-image, this sounds horrible. Okay, like what we're doing is actually promoting everybody having a poor image of themselves. But again, what is John really saying here? Take yourself out of the center of your own universe. The world doesn't revolve around you. Okay? The world doesn't revolve around you. Okay? One of the worst things about being a bishop. You go into a parish and people think that you want the world to revolve around you, Like when we were together as a family at Thanksgiving, my brothers were asking me, so where are you going for Christmas? And it's like, at this point, no place, because in fact, nobody wants a bishop around at Christmas time. We're too much work, and it's like, that's fine. I'll go down to the cathedral and I'll celebrate one of the cathedral masses with Bishop Alessic, But of course, my younger brothers so kindly invited me to celebrate Mass at their parishes, which I get to do this Christmas, which will be nice. But it's that whole idea that we can expect the world to revolve around us, okay? It was all boys in our family. I was never raised with a teenage girl, okay? But I've had enough experience with families who have had teenage girls. Okay? A little bit different than raising teenage boys. But oftentimes what happens, when they get into a mood, the world revolves around them. We can do the same thing as men, but that's the reality. That's a part of being human sometimes, is we want the world to revolve around us. And John's saying, take yourself out of the center of the universe. The world and all its inhabitants, near and far, do not revolve around you and your desires. So strive to take the focus off yourself. That's what John's saying. It doesn't mean that we can't be proud of our accomplishments or appreciate the gifts that God has given to us and our abilities or the skills that we have developed. But are we flaunting that all the time? Are we always pushing ourselves to the forefront? Do we always have to get in the last word in a conversation? Do we want to make ourselves appear to be important, more important than anybody else? John's like, no, that's not the way that Christ lived. No, he said, I came as one who serves. Not to be served, but to serve. So it's about taking ourselves out of the center, right? These 4 principles are not easy to live. Okay? They're not necessarily easy to live, but they're also not impossible. And the reason why they're not impossible, and that sometimes people never realize, because if you never get past chapter 13, you don't know what John says in chapter 14 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel. And in chapter 14, he says this, the soul then states that fired with love's urgent longings, it passed through the night of sense to union with the beloved. A love of pleasure and attachment to it usually fires the will towards enjoyment of things that give pleasure. A more intense enkindling of another better love, love of the soul's bridegroom, is necessary for the vanquishing of the appetites and the denial of this pleasure. By finding satisfaction and strength in this love, it will have the courage and the constancy to readily deny all other appetites. The love of its bridegroom is not the only requisite for conquering the strength of the sensitive appetites, and enkindling of urgent longings of love is also necessary. So those 4 principles, that's what we can do to prepare our lives to receive the revelation of God's presence and to receive the gift of contemplation from God. So this is our part in this process, okay? In this process of formation for contemplative living. John says, but God's got to do God's part. And God's part is to reveal himself to us in such a way that we fall in love. That we fall in love with him. Okay? You can't fall in love with somebody that you don't know. And God knows that. And so God will reveal himself to us in order to help us to fall in love. Because once you fall in love, then the choices that you make in life begin to be influenced by that love. Okay? For those of you who are married and you found your one true love in life, when the 2 of you got married, every other person that you had dated, had feelings for, all of them ended up in the background. They may have been an important part of your life at one point in time, but now there comes this one love to which you are willing to commit your whole life. Same thing happens in our relationship with God. God reveals himself and invites us to experience the depth of his love for us, which then changes the way that we live. So our efforts, John says, are not enough. God has to do his part, which is to inflame our lives with the Trinity's love for us. God revealing God's self to us. One can love God and still be attached to. Okay? So I'm tired, I'd rather veg out in front of the TV tonight. Yeah, I love God, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this instead. Even though I have this feeling that God is calling me to spend this time in prayer. So we can love God, but still be attached to other things. It's like trying to live in two worlds, with one foot in one world and one foot in the spiritual world. And John is saying to us, no, you got to let God lead you in such a way that God can help you to understand how to live in this world in union with God, in union with God's presence. So this movement towards transforming union is primarily God's work. So God calling us, inviting us, right? That happens in our experience of prayer. That happens in our reflection upon Scripture. That happens in our celebration of the sacraments, especially the Eucharist. It happens in our love relationships with others. It happens through our willingness to be of service to those around us. All of these things are means by which God can reveal God's presence to us and continue to invite us into a more intimate relationship with God. What we're called to do is to trust in God's action, in God's goodness and God's love for us. Because there's more that God can do for us than we can do for ourselves. And this is one of the most fundamental principles of all the Carmelite saints. This is God's work, primarily. And God's inviting us to go deeper. Which brings us to the end. So, John of the Cross, Living Flame of Love, Article 28, in his commentary on stanza 3. In the first place, it should be known that if anyone is seeking God, the beloved is seeking that person much more. If anyone is seeking God, the beloved is seeking that person much more. So we may think we're doing all sorts of things to seek the presence of God in our lives. God's doing far more than we can ever do in order to seek us out and to invite us, into a deeper relationship with God. So I will leave you with that note and with a list of other resources. So if you want to further your understanding of the teachings of John of the Cross, because I've just scratched the surface here this evening. If you want to learn more, these are some books that I would recommend to you. And all of these are written for anybody. These are not written for theologians. These are written for people who are serious about growing in the spiritual life and wanting to come to know God in a much more intimate way. So, and most of these books you can find on Amazon, because you can find everything on Amazon today. All right? That's it for me. Yes, oh yes, I do have to Yeah. So, I have a little brochure for you that is printed by the Institute of Carmelite Studies on what John of the Cross calls the prayer of loving attention. So this is another way that John invites us to experience prayer and to allow God in prayer to draw us more deeply into an awareness, a conscious awareness of God being present.